Can there be anything positive about Golus? The commentaries on the Torah explain that the various things that are negative in this week's parasha, in the Teicha, the rebuke, are not only warnings of what might happen to us if we disregard what Hashem says, but rather they're prophetic, describing things that really would happen. As Abravanel tells us, it's appropriate for us to know that the unblessings, the opposite of blessings, which are recorded in this week's parasha, are not there as some kind of a threat or some kind of an exaggeration to make us afraid, but they are inspired by divine spirit to predict what's going to happen to us later on in history, because the fact is that we see that all of the things described actually happened in our history. So what do these psukim talk about? Generally speaking, the theme of the section of Teicha of rebuke is all about what will happen with Golus. That Eibishter will scatter us through the nations. And the various commentaries go through the details. They show you how the things that are predicted in these psukim actually occurred after the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, which is the so-called fourth exile. And some of them even applied at the time of Golus Bavel, for example, people eating the flesh of their children, etc. It's clear that the theme of this whole parasha, which is a prediction of these terrible things that were going to happen, is not because the Eibishter wants to take revenge against us, chas v'shalom, or punish us. The purpose of these so-called curses is for our benefit. Like Rashi says in Parshas Nitzavim, that the so-called curses and the punishments, they are what establish us and allow us to stand firm in front of the Eibishter. So that's quite a positive spin on what's going on over here. Now that positive spin is what we're going to analyze in greater detail. But we have to understand. The Gemara Tainis tells us, there are 4 things that the Eibishter so-called regrets having created. They are Golus, Kasdi and the Babylonians, Vishmaelim and the descendants of Yishmael, V'yetzahara. The fact that the Eibishter so-called regrets creating the Golus implies that Golus is not in our interest or for our benefit, even though Rashi says it is, and so it would appear from the other Meforsha. Because the logic says if the purpose of Golus is to bring us a benefit, a benefit which we would never have accessed without the Golus, why would the Eibishter in any way regret having made it? It's for our benefit, it's a good thing. So that's what the Gemara says in Tainis, and we're going to spend a lot of our time here comparing how the Gemara in the Talmud Bavli presents it versus the Yerushalmi. Because of this question, maybe that explains why it is that the Yerushalmi only says there are 3 things that Hashem so-called regretted, and Golus is not one of them. And that would make sense, because Golus has a purpose, it has a value, it's beneficial for us, so the Eibishter doesn't regret it. But it would be a very difficult thing to explain that the reason the Yerushalmi does not list Golus as one of the things that the Eibishter regrets is because of this problem, that Golus is actually positive. Because that would imply that would imply a monumental debate between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi whether or not Golus has a benefit. The Bavli is saying no, and the Yerushalmi is saying yes. Because the truth is that this is not only a question with regards to Golus, it's a similar question about the other 3 things. How does the Eibishter regret making them, and do they have no benefit? Cast in the Babylonians, Vishmaelim and the children of Yishmael, V'yetzahara. What makes this question even stronger is the Mishnah in Perikei Avos tells us, whatever the Eibishter created, he only created for his own honor. That implies that everything that is created, which includes the Babylonians and the Yishmaelim and the Yetzirah, was all created for a good purpose, for the Eibishter's honor. How could you even suggest? Even these 3 things that both the Bavli and the Yerushalmi list, that the Eibishter regrets having made them, or Yerushalmi to use the language of the Yerushalmi, Toha Shebera'an, that the Eibush was almost dismayed that he created them. How's that possible? The Eibush created everything for a purpose and for his purpose. How could you suggest that there are things which are objectionable and the Eibush, so to speak, feels bad that he made them? So we need to understand, is there benefit to these things? Why is there a debate between the Bavli and Yerushalmi? And is it fair to say that Golus is for the purpose of something greater if the Eibush, so to speak, regrets having done it? So in order to get to this, let's first introduce a general principle in Judaism, which is we try and reduce arguments wherever possible. Wherever there's a way to explain that what appears to be a debate is actually not a debate, we're going to go with that. Or if done, for which reason it's logical to say in our case, there's no debate between the Bavli and Yerushalmi if Hashem regretted making Golus or not. That has to be a uniform perspective. And the answer to that would be, Golus is not something that has life of its own, that they should create it as an entity. The reason there's a Golus is because there's a Yetzer Hara. And therefore, when the Jewish people succumb to the temptations of the Yetzer Hara and therefore do things which are contrary to what the Eibishter wants, that precipitates Golus, as the Pasuk says, or as Davening says, it's because of our Averis that we were exiled. So Golus is not an entity in and of itself. It is a consequence of a different set of entities, which is the Yetzer Hara and its effect on us. With that in mind, even with the perspective of the Yerushalmi, who didn't say the word Golus in the list of things that Hashem regrets, because the Eibishter, in the Yerushalmi's words, is dismayed at the fact that he created a Yetzer Hara. That must include Golus as a natural consequence. If the Eibishter regrets the Yetzer Hara, he naturally regrets Golus. So there's no major debate over here between the Yerushalmi and the Bavli. It's just how you say the words. And we'll explain why it is that the Talmud, Bavli and Yerushalmi would say the words differently or express the concept differently. And that is because because the approach of the Talmud Yerushalmi is to speak about things in more broad terms than the specifics that the Bavli would unpack. So therefore the Yerushalmi doesn't tell us the detail of Golus, which is an effect, a consequence of the Yetzer Hara. Because the Yerushalmi is only talking about the cause. The cause is there's a Yetzer Hara, and the Eibishter regrets the Yetzer Hara. Naturally, if there were no Yetzer Hara, there'd be no Golus. I don't have to get into that level of detail. Whereas the Talmud Bavli, which always dives down into every little intricate detail, speaks about the Yetzer Hara as an entity, even though it is the cause of Golus, and the Golus is an entity because we get into the details of the various things and the factors that the Eibishter, so to speak, regrets having made. And to understand why they would take those different approaches is to take us back to one of the core differences between the whole learning approach of Talmud Bavli versus Yerushalmi. The reason for this distinction goes back to how the Talmud Bavli versus Yerushalmi understands Torah Bichlal. There are many topics that are brought succinctly in the Talmud Yerushalmi, and unpacked into the details and with a lot of lengthy explanation in Talmud Bavli. That is the interface between the relationship between the Talmud Bavli and Yerushalmi. Why is that? So the chronology actually helps us to understand why there's this difference. We know that the process of learning and establishing Talmud Bavli continued for a long time after the Talmud Yerushalmi was already completed. As the Rambam tells us, it's approximately a century after the conclusion of the Talmud Yerushalmi that they put together the Talmud Bavli. And therefore, why is that relevant? Because Talmud Bavli Talmud Yerushalmi. So that means that the Talmud Bavli, relative to Talmud Yerushalmi, has the status of what we call Basroi, a latter opinion. And latter opinions always collate everything that came before them and have to include and explain all of those preceding opinions. Parenthetically, that's also one of the reasons why, if there's a debate between Yerushalmi and Bavli, we paskin the halacha in favor of the Bavli, because the sages of the Talmud Bavli were late on in history. Therefore, because they therefore had access to all of the information presented in the Yerushalmi. When a person has access to more information, then the general axiom is we follow their opinion halachically. Coming back to our point, if you're talking about an earlier versus a later set of sages, the way it always works is that the earlier sages speak more succinctly and more generally, and the later sages get into greater detail and unpack what has already been said, like the Mishnah compared to the Gemara. Like you see, the language of the Mishnah is very, very precise and very concise, incorporating many, many details in single phrases. Whereas, compared to the language of the Gemara, which is composed at a later point in history, so the Gemara is much more expansive. We see a similar kind of distinction between Talmud Bavli, which came later, versus Talmud Yerushalmi, which came earlier, that Yerushalmi is much more succinct and Bavli is much more detailed. That would explain why the Talmud Yerushalmi only speaks about 3 things that the Eibishter regretted, and one of those is the Yetzer Hara, which also incorporates within it the possibility of Golus. Whereas the Talmud Bavli unpacks it into greater detail and says, you know what, there's a Yetzer Hara, which is true, and the Eibishter regrets that, but that also leads to Golus, and there's something fundamental about Golus that the Eibishter also, so to speak, regrets. Now, that would seem to be a good explanation, because here we're looking at the fact that Talmud Yerushalmi speaks more generally and succinctly, and Bavli is much more detailed, except that there's an example where it seems to be the reverse. We could ask a question about this principle that the Yerushalmi is always more succinct than the Bavli. Is the Gemara Masechta Tainis? The Gemara Tainis tells us, there are 3 keys that only the Eibishter holds, and are not delegated ever to any other representative. And they are Maftech Shel Kshamim, the key to causing rain, Maftech Shel Chaya, and the key for childbirth, Maftech Shel Tchias HaMesim, and the key for the resurrection. And then the Gemara continues, and in Eretz Yisrael, which is Talmud Yerushalmi, they say Af Maftech Shel Parnasa, even the key to a person's livelihood is only held by the Eibishter. There's nothing that a human being or anybody else could do. So that seems to fly in the face of what we've just said. We said that Eretz Yisrael, the way of learning, is much more precise and concise, and Bavli is much more detailed. Here's an example where the Bavli is only giving 3 examples, and the Yerushalmi is giving 4 examples. Here you're seeing the Bavli is much more concise. And using the same theory as we're seeing over here, where we said Golus is a consequence of Yetzer Hara, Parnasa is a consequence in an agricultural society of rain. Like the Gemara continues, why did Rabbi Yochanan, who came from Eretz Yisrael, who was the author of the Talmud Yerushalmi, Rabbi Yochanan in the Gemara over here, even though yes, he was the author of the Talmud Yerushalmi, but we were speaking over here about him as a representative Talmud Bavli. Why did he not include Parnasa? Because it says they're the same thing. Rain and Parnasa is the same. Livelihood is a result of rain. Because when there's rain, things grow, and that sustains people. So there, it seems to be that it works the exact opposite way around. That the Bavli is more succinct than the Yerushalmi. Except there's an easy answer for that. Vatir it's poshet. You say that klal analysis based when I give a Talmud Bavli v'Talmud Yerushalmi who shabavli basroi bisman b'yachas Yerushalmi. The whole principle we said was that the reason the Bavli has more detail is because it came later than the Talmud Yerushalmi, so therefore it has all of the information and insight that it can expand on. But over here in the Gemara, when it speaks about ma'arava, lo nemra bisman kodem yosem asher omer Rabbi Yochanan. It's ma'arava is an opinion discussing or debating with Rabbi Yochanan, who lived at the same time as Ma'arava. That's what they said. Also Parnasa, implying that they're part of the same conversation and adding information to the conversation. In other words, whoever the representative of Eretz Yisrael is in that conversation is not living earlier. They're part of the conversation. Then the same time frame, but making their comment after the comment was proposed by Rabbi Yochanan. Look, who is the person speaking over here? It is Rabbi Yochanan, who was the editor of the Talmud Yerushalmi. In which case, it makes perfectly sense and it follows the chronology. We are talking about Rabbi Yochanan, who belongs to the world of Talmud Yerushalmi, who comes earlier on in history, and therefore is much more succinct, and therefore says that rain actually includes Parnasa, even though he is speaking right now in Talmud Bavli. ולאחר מכן, and then after that, we quote people who, yes, geographically come from Eretz Yisrael, but chronologically come at the same time as Rabbi Yochanan and are speaking after Rabbi Yochanan, in which case they can expand on what Rabbi Yochanan said, and they could say, rain also includes parnasa. So therefore, it is acceptable to believe, to understand, that the Talmud Yerushalmi is always going to be more succinct. Therefore, it lists three things that the Eibishter regretted. The Bavli is going to be more expansive, and therefore will include a fourth, even though that Golus is an outcome of Yetzer Hara, because that's the style of Talmud Bavli. But we still got to get to the core questions over here. If the Eibishter regrets the Yetzer Hara, which is the cause of Golus, why do you have to get into the detail? And he also regrets the Golus. Well, surely that's self-understood. If he regrets the Yetzer Hara, which causes the Golus, naturally he regrets the Golus. If you regret the cause, that implies that you regret the consequence. So, in order to answer that, let's address another question. Or maybe it's not a question, maybe it's just a lack of clarity that we have. And that is, why is Golus on the list of things that the Eibush so-called regretted? The Eibush, as we mentioned before, did not create Golus as an entity, like he created the sun and the moon and the stars. Or he created a Yetzer Hara, which is an entity that he made at the beginning of creation. And Golus is a variable that depends on our choices and our behavior. If a person succumbs to the temptation of the Yetzer Hara and then does not repair it through tshuva, then Golus happens. In other words, Golus is a factor of our behavior. It's inappropriate to say that the Eibishter regrets it. The Eibishter doesn't make it, we make it. So why are you even putting it on the list? Even in the Talmud Bavli. Unless you're going to say that when we speak about Golus, that the Eibishter regrets, he's not saying people do things wrong, it's their choice, and that creates consequences, which creates suffering for them, and Golus is that suffering. The question is, why is Golus chosen as the consequence? The fact that there will be a consequence of our behavior is a natural progression. That's what the Eibishter decided, that we get to choose our lives and based on that the things that happen to us. The question is, why did he create Golus as one of the options? The Eibishter has an infinite range of ways in which he could cause people to have to pay for their choices, bad choices. Look at the Teicha. There's a long list of 98 things that, they're all kinds of punishments. They're not all Golus. Why did the Eibishter choose Golus? And that is the question of what the Eibishter so-called regrets, that he chose Golus as a punishment consequence for our Averis. That would explain what the Gemara is saying. There are four things that the Eibishter regretted. And the Golus stands alone independently of Yetzer Hara. Because yes, it is true that Golus is precipitated by us succumbing to the Yetzer Hara. Because Golus is a response to Averis which are caused by the Yetzer Hara. But as mentioned, Golus does not have to be the response to the Yetzer Hara. There has to be a response. Who said it has to be Golus? So the Eibishter created a system where poor choices result in consequences, and then he regretted that one of the consequences, in fact the primary consequence that he chose, was Golus. What's also interesting is, if you have a look in the Gemara, it puts Golus before the Yetzer Hara. Remember, logically, it should first tell us Hashem regrets the Yetzer Hara, and then say, and he regrets the things that result from the Yetzer Hara, the Golus. It's not what the Gemara said. First thing on the list that Hashem regrets, the Golus. Even though practically speaking, Golus happens after the Yetzer Hara has been active. Why is that? That's because the Gemara wants to emphasize that the Eibishter's regret of making Golus is not only regret of the fact that there is a consequence of our actions called Golus, as a punishment for our poor choices. But rather, Golus, in and of itself, is something that David should regret, shouldn't have happened. Now, once we understand that, that will help us appreciate the difference between the approach of the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. So that would imply that the distinction between the Bavli and Yerushalmi is not only do we look at the general, as we originally said, Yerushalmi only looks at the general principles, and the Bavli at the details, because now we're saying there's more than just details over here. Golus is a fundamentally negative thing that the Eibusher regrets. And in Shaplukta, that implies that there is a debate. According to the Yerushalmi, the thing Hashem regrets is the Yetzer Hara. And naturally, because the Eibusher regrets the Yetzer Hara, naturally he regrets that there's a consequence called Golus. Once the Eibusher is dismayed over the Yetzer Hara, he's naturally dismayed on the Golus. That is the approach of the Yerushalmi. Whereas the Yerushalmi is not saying that there's something fundamental about Golus in and of itself that is so bad that the Eibusher regrets, because it doesn't mention the word Golus. Whereas the Bavli says, in addition to the fact that the Eibusher regrets a Yetzer Hara, the Eibusher also specifically regrets the fact that there should be Golus as a consequence for the Yetzer Hara. And also, by the way, even though we said the reason Golus comes first is because the Bavli wants to illustrate to us that it is fundamentally what the Eibusher regrets, it's still not so clear. Because we get it, that the Golus comes before the Yetzer Hara. What we don't understand is why Golus has to be the first on the list of all four things. Could have said that the Eibusher regretted Golus and the Yetzer Hara, and then the custom Yishmaelim, or custom Yishmaelim, and then Golus Yetzer Hara. Also, the order in which the proofs are brought from the various psukim matches this. Why? So the explanation is this. The debate between the Bavli and Yerushalmi is not only how many things belong on the list of what the Eibusher regrets. 4 in the Bavli, 3 in the Yerushalmi. Listen to the language, and this will be our greatest clue to understanding what the different messaging is of the Bavli and Yerushalmi. When you pay attention to the language, it tells you the theme of what they're trying to express. Lashena Bavli, as we've already said, the Talmud Bavli tells us, there are 4 things that the Eibusher regrets creating. But completely differently, Lashena Yerushalmi, the Lashon of the Yerushalmi is, Shloisha bara HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There are 3 things that the Eibusher created. And then, afterwards he was upset that he created them. In other words. But Bavli, the Talmud Bavli is giving us one message. The single message is, these are things that Hashem regrets. The Talmud Yerushalmi is telling us there's 2 things over here. First we have to acknowledge, these are things that the Eibusher created. And then, after he created them, he was upset that he created them. Now that language is a subtle difference with a major difference in meaning. Moving on Pashut. First, let's clarify that when we speak about the Eibusher having remorse or regret, it's not in the way that we experience it. That the Eibusher says, "Oy vey, I should never have done that," changes his mind. That's not shaykh. And when we speak about the Eibusher regretting something, it really means that there's a negative component to what the Eibusher made. On the other hand, but in the Yerushalmi's language, when you say this is something that Hashem created, and then only after that you tell us that he had regret, but first you tell us he created it, that implies that it's got something positive associated with it. In other words, the Talmud Bavli is only focused on the negative. That there's something negative in each of these 4 things. Therefore, the language is, there are 4 things Hashem regretted. In other words, there are 4 things that have something negative about them. Whereas the Yerushalmi says, there are 3 things that have something positive to them, and yet they evolved something negative, or afterwards the Eibusher identified something negative, or in the current form they're negative, and therefore he regretted them. The This is something which is told us in the Torah. Something that's recorded in the Torah, whether it be scripture or whether it be, like in this case, from the sages. It's not just to tell us information, that this is the way that the Eibusha sees a certain thing, and especially if it's a negative association with that thing. If the Torah is giving us this information, it's because it's relevant to us. To teach us something and how we should go about serving the Eibusha. And that is what sits at the core of the two different versions of the statement. If it's like in the Bavli, that there are four things that the Eibusha regrets, which focuses very much on the negative elements of these four things. Or like in the Yerushalmi, where there's first an introduction, three things the Eibusha created, implying that they have something of value, and then regretted. When you're in the Bavli and you only speak about Hashem's regret and nothing else, then effectively the messaging of the Talmud Bavli is, these are not real things. They will eventually disappear from society. Because they are created in a way of so-called regret, which means that the Eibusha's real intention is not interested in these things. They serve a particular purpose at this time, and when their purpose is finished, they will be disposed of. Whereas in the Yerushalmi, if you start with a statement, these are things that the Eibusha created. That implies that there's something about them that constitutes being the Eibusha's creation, which means they are things that the Eibusha wants. Which means they have a lasting element to them. They've got a spark of godliness in them, like anything else that the Eibusha created. But then we have to clarify, but there is also a negative element to them. And in fact, it's the negativity within them that is temporary and will eventually dissipate. So in the Talmud Bavli, if something is negative, there'll come a time where it no longer exists. In the Talmud Yerushalmi, if something is created by the Eibusha and it has negativity, it will continue to exist, but the negativity will be neutralized. Which explains the difference between the Bavli and Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi is looking through the lens that we're talking about things that will last indefinitely. Because the Eibusha created them, what the Eibusha creates is for real. So they'll exist even into the time of Mashiach. It's just that whatever negativity is currently associated with them, that will disappear. That's the part that the Eibusha is, so to speak, upset about. That's why the Yerushalmi does not mention Golus as a possibility on this list. Because Golus is altogether negative and has to disappear in the time of Mashiach. It doesn't belong on a list of things that the Eibusha created with a purpose, and eventually they'll get rid of their toxic side and serve their purpose. Golus is not that way. It is only negative. So they only list the three things which will have value and utility in the time of Mashiach. Because the nations of the world will survive into the Messianic age. And it's just that the reality of who they will be radically different to who they are now. Not only will they cease to be anti-Semitic persecutors of the Jews, but to the contrary, they'll be transformed into something positive, and they'll become the assistants to the Jewish people. Like the prophecy of Yeshaya, that foreigners will get up and shepherd your flocks. The pasuk says that the Eibusha will convert their language to all call out to the Eibusha and serve the Eibusha in unison. And the same with the Yetzer Hara, the negativity, the toxicity of the Yetzer Hara, well, that will disappear when Mashiach comes. But the incredible power and as we well know, the innovation of the Yetzer Hara will be converted into something positive that will have utility in the time of Mashiach. Like the Gemara tells us that before the Chet Eitz Hadas, the snake was considered Shamash HaGodel. It was there to help people. It was supposed to go and bring us beautiful jewels and whatever the Gemara tells us. And not only that there'll be negative transformed into positive, that the Yetzer Hara will become an asset, and that the nations of the world will assist us, but it will have the mile of tshuva, where something has been in the dark and now come into the light, which is much more powerful than something that was born into the light. In other words, that means the value of the Yetzer Hara, or the nations of the world, is not only because they provide challenge for us, and that challenge helps us to strengthen and elevate ourselves. Because the truth is, Golus does the same for us. It also forces us into situations that we have to stand up for our Judaism and be much more committed. But there's actual value in keeping the Yetzer Hara and the nations of the world alive in the time of Mashiach. Because they will become part of the goodness of that era. The Rebbe says in Tanya that the Yerushalmi teaches us that what Avraham Avinu was able to achieve is Shasa Yetzer Hara Tov. He turned his Yetzer Hara into Yetzer Tov. Like the pasuk says, yes, levavoi, plural word, that is, both sides of his heart were committed to the Eibishter. As we know that every one of us can achieve, at least, for certainly practically, and at least even temporarily, to serve the Eibishter with both sides of the heart, the Yetzer Tov and with the Yetzer Hara. That's in the world of the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi is talking about those things that in their current form are counterproductive, but in the time of Mashiach will be turned around, transformed, elevated. Whereas the Babli is only talking about the negative aspect of these various things on the list. She asked it safely his battle, which will eventually be neutralized. So the Babli is only saying whatever is bad about these things, that's what we're talking about, and they will disappear. Which is why the Babli could put Golus onto the list. In fact, first on the list. Because when it comes to negating the negativity of Golus, it's much more extreme than the Yetzer Hara and the Kasdim in Yishmaelim. Yetzer Hara, Kasdim in Yishmaelim will get rid of the negative and allow them then to contribute positively to society. Golus only has negative, and therefore it is, so to speak, the Aviyavai Satuma, first thing on the list, and it's got to completely go. Even though Golus does elevate us to higher and more complete levels of connection to the Eibishter. Because if we did not have Golus, we would never have to find the incredible power of Mesiras Nefesh, etc., as we see replete throughout the whole of Chassidus. The benefit is a result of the Golus, whereas the Golus experience itself, the existence of Golus, Tizbata, the Gamri Yosit Lavai, has to completely disappear in the time of Mashiach, opening the way for an eternal Geula, which can never be followed by any further Golus. And the fact that the Babli then put Golus at the top of the list is indicative of how the Babli sees the other things on the list. We're not here debating if they have a spark of good in them that has to survive. Which they created in the language of how the Yerushalmi said, which would sustain them in the long term. The Babli says we're only focused on what negative aspect they have. The part of it that has to disappear in the future, and in Golus, it's not a part of it, it's the whole of it. Now, why would there be this debate in these two different perspectives of the Babli and Yerushalmi? That has to do with the general way that Babli and Yerushalmi look at situations. This fits perfectly with an overarching distinction between how Babli and Yerushalmi look at issues. The Rebbe has explained to us before. The Babli fundamentally looks at situations as they are currently, whereas the Talmud Yerushalmi is focused on how things could be in an ideal state. And from the perspective of the Yerushalmi, the future state is actually more relevant and overrides the reality of the current state. Which explains the different approaches here. Let's say you go with the Babli's perspective, which is we're just going to talk about the things that the Eibishter regrets. In other words, representing the things that have negativity, and that negativity has to be removed. Or you look from the perspective of the Yerushalmi, that we're also detecting the goodness in them, the fact that they created them, which means in the future they'll be converted into something positive. If something in the future will disappear, that means that even now it is not absolutely real. Like we see in halacha, that if you have a river that is a perennial river and it dries up every few years, even once in 7 years, we call it a false river. You cannot use that water in order to get the mechatas for the Beis Hamikdash because it's not considered living water, because occasionally it dries up. Why? Because the principle is because we know for certain that this river is not going to flow in 7 years. Even now, it's not considered a real river. In the same way, if something is going to disappear from the landscape when Mashiach comes, then even now it's not a reality. And it's very important for us to have that perspective. It's not a reality, even though it feels like a reality. Which means that the current state of something that in the future will disappear is that currently it's not real. Even before it's disappeared. Now, the fact that there is a spark of positive in them that will cause those elements, the Yetzer Hara, the Kasdim Mishmeidim, to be converted into something positive, that's surprising. Because that means in the future, they will be in a way that is contrary to their current natural state. That's only going to happen in the future. Therefore, the Talmud Bavli is looking at the here and now, says these 4 things all have to disappear. Because the Bavli looks, now these are negative things, that negative has to disappear, therefore these things don't really exist. And the reason why Bavli looks at the now and Yerushalmi looks at the future, so Yerushalmi can say there is value in these things in the future. And they should create it, and with that value in mind, that's because, generally speaking, Bavli and Yerushalmi is the difference between seeing things clearly in the Yerushalmi or having to grope in the darkness in the Bavli. Just Talmud Bavli Nema, we know that Talmud Bavli is alluded to in the pasuk in Eicha b'mechashakim moishivani, that David just sat me in the darkness. Zet Talmud Shabavel refers to Talmud Bavli. Which implies that if you're living in Bavel, you're living in darkness, you're living in a reality of concealment of godliness. And in the darkness, you've got to find and release whatever latent light there might be. Vilu Yerushalmi b'chinasor. Well, it's Yerushalmi, that's Eretz Yisrael. That's clarity. That's light. Okay, which, by the way, is why in Yerushalmi things are more general and succinct, without all the debate and the back and forth and the insights. Whereas the Talmud Bavli, there's questions and proofs and counterproofs and arguments, and the same conversation goes on for a long time. Why is that? Here's a metaphor. If you're sitting in a place that is illuminated, you can immediately find what you're looking for. You don't have to schlep around. There's what I'm looking for. I go directly. I get it to Talmud Yerushalmi. You know the message you have to convey. There's the message. But if you're in the dark, you have to start fumbling, you have to start searching until you find what you're looking for. And then only after a period of time, you'll eventually discover what it is that you were looking for. And it's the same thing. If you're trying to work something out logically, which is what Talmud Bavli does, to help us understand what the Torah wants us to know, it takes time. We've got to refine, we've got to clarify, make sure that we're understanding things correctly and not going down the wrong direction. When you're living in the light, which is the reality of Talmud Yerushalmi in Eretz Yisrael, then it's fairly straightforward to find the meaning, to find the deeper insight into every single thing. You literally go as the crow flies to your objective. So therefore the Yerushalmi is able to look at the Yetzer Hara and see in the Yetzer Hara what it really is, not what it looks like now, what it really is and how it will add value in the time of Mashiach. And therefore could say, something that the Eibusher created with a purpose. But when a person is trapped in their own dark recesses of their mind, which means lack of clarity, then you have to learn with the guidance of the Talmud Bavli, which is find out, ask, query, go back, forth. Because you can't immediately see what the deeper message is and the deeper reality is. Which will eventually emerge into consciousness. And the Rakas Amatzav I can only see where I am now, what's right in front of my eyes. I'm in the dark. Right now, the Torah is negative, the custom are negative, the Shmeidim are negative. And then I have to struggle through this particular negativity, which is the negativity of something that doesn't truly exist, it's just in my way right now, until eventually I get to the point where I recognize, you know what? This isn't real. The Yetzer Hara feels so overwhelming, but it isn't real. And that's going to take me time until eventually I have that clarity. And that teaches us a powerful lesson. Firstly, we have to be absolutely clear that Golus is not a comfortable place for the Jewish people. The Eibishter himself regrets it. This is not a reality that the Eibishter wants for us. That information was shared with every single Jewish person. We have to recognize if the Eibishter is, so to speak, remorseful of the Golus, we have to be uncomfortable in the Golus. We have to recognize Golus is an aberration that is the consequence of our poor choices. And if, God forbid, a Jewish person feels differently, so he's comfortable in Golus, loves the Golus, embraces the Golus, and says, that this is where we belong, this is what, so to speak, what's coming to us. Any person who defends the reality of Golus is contradicting what the Eibishter says. Because the Eibishter regrets Golus. And that is v'acharati b'chol yom, a daily experience. Even if it's Tisha B'Av, that day the Eibishter says, I wish there was no Tisha B'Av. Can you imagine how profoundly dark it is for the person who's living trapped in the darkness within Golus to believe that Golus is a good thing? But on the other hand, also to live in Golus, recognizing it's not the way things should be, and the Eibishter regrets it, should not cause us, God forbid, to be down. We shouldn't be overwhelmed by the Golus, because it's not true. And eventually, and immediately, it's going to disappear. Especially now that we're at the last moments of Mashiach coming. When there's pressure and expectation of us to hasten the coming of Mashiach. By adding in mitzvahs and adding in Torah which illuminate the world, and that's going to remove the darkness of the Golus. We dare not believe that Golus is overwhelming and something we can't change. We have to believe it is not real, it is transient, and our mitzvahs will completely clear it. As well as he has a lesson of how we should relate to the nations of the world represented in the Gemara we have by the Kasdim Yishmaelim. We shouldn't be overwhelmed by the nations. Whatever opposition they may have, or persecution, God forbid, of the Jewish people, doesn't have real strength. So therefore, if we have to engage with and speak to the nations of the world about our dedication to Torah and mitzvahs, we have to stand with absolute firmness and strength. Like the famous story in the Gemara about Gvir ben Sisa, who was this hunchback, and everybody thought he was a nobody, and he went up and he debated in front of Alexander the Great to dismiss various claims against the Jewish people. Successfully, because he stood up with a token and said, this is the reality. Taking that approach, if we take that attitude of standing firm in our belief and commitment to our Judaism and saying what has to be said about the Jewish position, then that causes, even before Mashiach comes, a foretaste of the prophecy about Mashiach, where the great leaders of the world will become us, those helping us, servicing us. As has happened multiple times in history, including an example we're about to have a look at, which the Eibishter inspired to be included in Torah in the Gemara, in order that it should be a living lesson for all of us. What's the story? Amar Ravashi. Ravashi tells a story. Amri Huna bar Nosson. This man told him, Zimne Chodava Kamina Kamei de Izgedar Malka. I was once standing in front of Izgedar the king, who says Rashi was a Melech Parasaya. He was a Persian king. And he lifted up my girdle. He lowered my girdle, which was a bit high on my chest. His belt had lifted quite high. As Rashi says, so to make him look dignified, the king himself came and lowered his belt. And that didn't end there. And he said, he told me, you are written in the Torah as a nation of royalty and priests. And says Rashi, you have to have the dignity of a Kohen, where it says that their belts may not be up high up, by the armpits, which is a place of perspiration. It's not respectful. You've got to lower your girdle. That's the story in the Gemara. When he came and told the story to Ameimer, he said, you have lived the fulfillment of the prophecy that says the kings will be your servants. And we can't teaching us. When a Jew behaves in such a way that anybody who sees us can detect that we belong to the royal family and to a kingdom of Kehanim, then the nations of the world, the leaders of those nations, will tell us, remind us that we have to stand up with dignity. They'll physically help us to do so, which will have a tremendous publicity, obviously. But Torah, as we know, is eternal. It is the guidance, it is the illumination for every single person who stands up with the pride of the Torah, which is our inheritance. And certainly that we should not bend our heads in submission to trends that are non-Jewish trends, or to people who are non-Jewish people dictating to us how we should live. And we do that together with our work to transform the Yetzer Hara to the extent of what the Shema tells us, that we should serve the Eibishter not only with the Yetzer Hara as well. And that will allow us that even now on Erev Shabbos, again across the span of history, the Erev Shabbos of 6 millennia, we can already taste, as the Arizal says, all the various delicacies that are reserved for the time of Shabbos, which is the time of Mashiach. We should already be able to have them now, specifically the support of the nations of the world. And that will hasten the Eibishter's promise that he puts an end to the darkness. He'll neutralize the Golus, and that will bring immediately the absolute Gula with Mashiach right now.